The first encounter. Mark Daniels had always prided himself on his calm and collected demeanor, especially when it came to flying. After all, aviation wasn't just his job, it was his life. Every takeoff, every landing, and every minute in the air was a part of his identity. But today, standing in the middle of LAX's congested terminal, the weight of the past few days seemed to hang on his shoulders like an invisible anchor. The hours spent in the sky, the pressure of coordinating schedules, and the constant rush to get to the next destination were starting to chip away at his patience. He glanced around the chaotic airport, his mind drifting back to his last flight, a transcontinental journey from New York to Los Angeles, where he had been on autopilot most of the time. The passengers had slept, the crew had performed their duties without incident, and he had spent most of the flight staring out into the endless expanse of clouds. But the moment he touched down at LAX, all that quiet had evaporated. The noise, the rush, and the feeling of being just another cog in the machine took over. As he shifted his weight from one foot to the other, Mark's thoughts were interrupted by the soft hum of the airport's PA system announcing delayed flights, gate changes, and various other tidbits of information that nobody ever seemed to pay attention to. His eyes flicked back to the young pilot still standing at the check-in desk. The man looked even more out of place now that Mark had a moment to observe him more closely. He wasn't just young, he was new to the world of aviation in a way that seemed almost unnatural. There was a certain gleam in his eyes, a spark of naivete that Mark couldn't quite place. The young pilot, who looked no older than 25, was dressed in his crisp uniform, a stark contrast to the disheveled appearance of many of the other travelers in the line. His blonde hair was neatly combed, and his posture was so perfect it seemed like it had been trained into him by years of practice. He stood there with a carefree smile, completely oblivious to the wear and tear of the job that Mark knew too well. Mark couldn't help but roll his eyes. "Must be nice," Mark muttered under his breath, though the words were meant for no one but himself. The young pilot's carefree attitude seemed like an insult to everything Mark had worked for. The arrogance was palpable, and it grated on Mark's nerves. As the line inched forward, Mark's mind continued to race. How could someone who looked so fresh and untarnished possibly understand the sacrifices that came with the job? How could he appreciate the years of effort it took to get to this point in their careers? Mark had put in countless hours, every long-haul flight, every delayed arrival, every challenge that came with the job had shaped him into the pilot he was today. And yet, here was this young man, with his perfect uniform and smug smile, acting as though he had mastered aviation with little more than a few months of training. Finally, the moment arrived. Mark stepped up to the check-in counter, his mind still simmering from the earlier interaction. The agent, a woman with short, spiky hair and a no-nonsense expression, looked up from her screen just long enough to scan his boarding pass. The moment she looked at him, Mark could feel the skepticism radiating off her. It was subtle, but unmistakable. "Business class?" she asked flatly, as if she wasn't entirely convinced. Mark was too tired to respond with anything other than a simple, "Yes, business class." The agent gave him a cursory glance before pressing a few buttons on her keyboard. She didn't seem to acknowledge the exhaustion in his eyes or the fatigue that marked his every movement. It wasn't uncommon for airline staff to underestimate passengers based on appearances, but something about the way she scanned him felt personal. "You don't seem the type," she muttered under her breath, barely loud enough for him to hear. Mark's jaw clenched. He had heard this kind of thing before, people who looked at him and assumed that he didn't belong in business class. They didn't understand the nature of his work. They didn't know the hours he had spent flying from one coast to the other, the long shifts, the sleepless nights, the constant pressure of managing a multi-million-dollar aircraft and a crew of professionals. It wasn't just about looking the part, it was about earning it through hard work and dedication. Before he could say anything, the agent handed him his boarding pass. "Have a nice flight," she said in a voice that lacked the warmth one would expect from someone working in customer service. Mark gritted his teeth and took the pass. As he turned to leave, he couldn't help but glance over at the young pilot again, still chatting away with the flight attendant as if he had all the time in the world. The sight made Mark's blood boil. But it was the smug little smirk the young man gave him as their eyes met that really set him off. That smirk, it was the final straw. Mark's hand tightened around the handle of his carry-on bag as he walked away. He was used to the occasional judgment from strangers, but this felt different. This felt like more than just an assumption based on appearance. It felt like an entire life of hard work and sacrifice had been reduced to nothing more than a label. He wasn't just another passenger. He wasn't some average guy who had paid for an upgrade. No, Mark Daniels was a pilot, the kind of pilot who had earned his seat through years of experience, dedication, and determination. But none of that mattered to these people. As he walked past the pilot, their eyes met again. This time, Mark didn't look away. He wanted the young man to understand one simple thing. Mark wasn't just here to fly. He wasn't just here to sit in business class because he could afford it. He was here because he had worked for it, and no amount of fresh-faced enthusiasm or privileged arrogance could change that. What the young pilot didn't know, and what the check-in agent couldn't possibly have realized, was that Mark was no ordinary passenger. He wasn't just an exhausted traveler looking for a few hours of comfort. He was a seasoned professional in the sky, and when he returned to that airport later today, he would be the one behind the cockpit doors, the one commanding the flight that would carry them all to their next destination. The irony wasn't lost on him. It was almost poetic that the same man who had been mocked for his appearance would soon be the one taking charge of the very plane they would all board. As he made his way toward security, Mark could already feel the adrenaline starting to stir. He wasn't just going to board that flight as a passenger. He was going to take command. And when he did, he would make sure that every single person on that plane knew exactly who was in charge. They thought they knew him. They thought they could judge him based on what they saw. But they had no idea what it meant to be in his shoes, the real challenge. As Mark Daniels made his way through the bustling terminal, he couldn't help but feel a tightening in his chest, a sensation that was all too familiar. The kind of pressure that came from being constantly underestimated. It wasn't new. It wasn't something that had appeared only today. It had followed him for years, ever since he had entered the field of aviation. But there was something particularly galling about the way the young pilot had looked at him. It wasn't just an assumption, it was a presumption. And that was something Mark could not let slide. The thing about being a pilot, especially one with as many hours under his belt as Mark, was that there was a certain understanding you developed over time. An intuitive grasp of the responsibility that came with being in command. Mark had flown enough red-eye flights, had worked enough grueling overnighters, to know exactly how to handle the turbulence, not just in the air, but also in life. It wasn't all about flying smoothly through clear skies, it was about navigating storms. Navigating the kind of storms that raged in people's hearts when they thought they knew your story but didn't know half of it. The young pilot, John Rivers, was just a blip in Mark's radar. A flash of a smile, a moment of arrogance, and that was it. But today was different. Today, Mark wasn't just any traveler passing through. He was a pilot with a purpose, one that didn't involve sitting idly by in the business class cabin. No, he was going to take charge. And by the time the young man realized his mistake, it would be too late to change his tune. As he passed through security and made his way to the gate for his flight, Mark tried to shake off the feeling of agitation that had settled into his chest. But it wasn't easy. The terminal was a sea of people, each of them caught up in their own worlds, but Mark's mind remained firmly on what had happened earlier. He couldn't just forget the way the check-in agent had looked at him, or the way John Rivers had smirked, as though he knew something Mark didn't. When he reached the gate, Mark did what he did best, he disappeared into the background. It was his usual strategy when dealing with the endless ebb and flow of passengers. He'd settle into a quiet corner, blend in, and keep to himself. But today, his mind was racing, a whirlwind of thoughts too fast to grasp fully. The last few years in aviation had felt like a long, slow march, each flight a step toward a goal he had long since forgotten. He was good at his job, very good, but the constant strain was starting to weigh on him. Seated in a far corner of the lounge, he sipped his coffee slowly, trying to steady his nerves. He had a few minutes before he needed to board, but those minutes stretched endlessly in his mind. It wasn't the flight that was bothering him. It wasn't even the delay or the airport chaos, it was the feeling that he had something to prove. That somehow, he needed to show this young pilot, and everyone else who doubted him, that he was more than just a face in the crowd. He was a pilot with years of experience, with wisdom gained from thousands of miles in the air. The announcement to board the flight crackled over the intercom, and Mark stood up, his mind shifting gears. He had always been the kind of person who thrived under pressure, the kind who welcomed challenges, no matter how steep or overwhelming they seemed. He had been flying planes for nearly a decade now, but it had never felt like enough. There was always more to learn, more to master, more to achieve. Today would be no different. As he made his way to the gate, he couldn't help but notice the bustling crew. They were all busy preparing for the flight, checking equipment, confirming seating arrangements, ensuring that everything was in place for a smooth journey. John Rivers was nowhere to be seen, but Mark wasn't surprised. The young pilot likely had his own tasks to complete, and Mark knew the routine well enough to understand that there was little room for distraction once the work started. Mark scanned the crew one last time before boarding, noting how everyone moved with a practiced precision. There was something about the professionalism of it all that calmed him. He had been part of this world for long enough to know that despite all the pomp and circumstance, everyone on that plane was working toward the same goal, ensuring the passengers arrived safely, with as little fuss as possible. But that didn't mean Mark was going to let his earlier interaction slide. The moment he boarded that plane, he would take his seat at the controls and make sure that every single person in that cabin knew who was in charge. John Rivers might have been flying as well, but Mark was a man of experience, and experience was something no smirk or snide remark could erase. As the passengers began to file in, Mark made his way to the cockpit. The crew members nodded in recognition as he passed, but it was the subtle shift in the air as he entered the cockpit that Mark noticed most. It was like a switch had been flipped, the mood in the cabin had changed, and it wasn't just because of the weight of the aircraft or the hustle of final preparations. There was something different now. Something authoritative. Mark's very presence in the cockpit seemed to command respect, even from the young pilots who were still learning the ropes. John Rivers appeared moments later, clipboard in hand, ready to go through his final checks. He didn't seem to acknowledge Mark directly at first, but there was a flicker of recognition in his eyes as he saw who was seated at the controls. The young man froze, his posture stiffening for just a second before he quickly resumed his work. Mark gave him a curt nod, but there was no need for pleasantries. This wasn't the time for small talk or niceties. They both had a job to do, and Mark was focused entirely on that. His hands moved over the familiar controls, checking the systems, reviewing the flight plan, and making sure everything was in order. His mind clicked into autopilot mode, but not in the way you might think. This was the autopilot of experience, an internal rhythm that Mark had mastered over the years. Everything in his life had led him to this moment, and he wasn't going to let a smug young pilot or a dismissive check-in agent throw him off course. As the plane began to taxi down the runway, Mark felt the familiar rush of adrenaline flood his veins. There was something about the hum of the engines and the roar of the aircraft as it gained speed that always made him feel alive. It was the moment where the ground no longer mattered. It was just him, the aircraft, and the sky. But as they prepared for takeoff, Mark couldn't help but glance at the young pilot once more. John Rivers was seated beside him, his hands nervously gripping the armrests, his eyes wide with a mix of excitement and apprehension. Mark wondered if he even realized the gravity of the responsibility he was about to undertake. He had no idea what it was like to shoulder the burden of leadership in the cockpit. To carry the lives of everyone on board, to make split-second decisions that could mean the difference between life and death. And yet, Mark wasn't angry. No, he wasn't angry anymore. He was simply going to show John Rivers, and anyone else who doubted him, that there was a reason he was in charge. That no matter how young or inexperienced someone might be, there was something that came with age and experience that couldn't be taught in a classroom. Something that only the skies could give. As the plane lifted off, Mark's grip tightened on the controls. The world beneath them shrank, and he felt the familiar sense of power that came with commanding the sky. John Rivers was in the seat next to him, but it was Mark who was flying the plane. And as the young man looked over at him, Mark couldn't help but smile to himself. It was clear that the lesson was just beginning. Underneath the surface. The plane soared through the sky, climbing higher and higher, leaving the city behind. The engines hummed steadily, and the gentle vibration of the aircraft provided a sense of reassurance. It was here, at this altitude, that Mark felt most at home. Everything else faded away, the chaos of LAX, the dismissive looks, the presumptions people made based on appearances. Up here, in the cockpit, there were no judgments, no doubts, no distractions. There was only the task at hand, to fly the plane, to ensure the safety of every person on board, and to do it all with a sense of calm that could only come from years of experience. Mark's hands were steady on the controls, his eyes constantly scanning the instruments, his mind already a few steps ahead of the flight's trajectory. He didn't need to think about it anymore, it was automatic. The years of training, the countless hours spent in the air, had all led him to this point. And yet, as he glanced over at his co-pilot, John Rivers, he couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. The young man's nervousness was palpable, even through the professional exterior he tried so hard to maintain. His fingers twitched on the console, and his eyes darted over the instruments as though he were memorizing every detail, trying to reassure himself that he was in control. The smile that had greeted Mark earlier, the one that oozed with youthful arrogance, was long gone. In its place was a tight-lipped expression of concentration, but there was something else there too, something that Mark couldn't quite put his finger on. It wasn't just nerves. It was a sense of doubt. Mark couldn't blame him. Everyone who stepped into the cockpit for the first time felt that overwhelming weight, the pressure of knowing that lives were in your hands. But what set Mark apart from John Rivers was that Mark had learned to embrace that pressure. He had internalized it, used it as fuel. He didn't shy away from responsibility, he welcomed it. It was a part of who he was. But from the way John was shifting in his seat, it was clear that he hadn't yet learned that lesson. Mark's eyes flicked back to the sky outside, the endless blue stretching out before them. He could feel the subtle shift in the air as the plane leveled off, the steady pace now a rhythm. They were just another flight on another day. But for some reason, today felt different. He could sense it in the way John was acting. It wasn't just the inexperience. It was something deeper, something more subtle. And that something kept pulling at Mark's attention, even though he knew he should be focusing on the task at hand. They flew in silence for a while. Mark continued to monitor the systems, checking the navigation and making sure everything was running smoothly. But it wasn't long before John broke the quiet. His voice, though quiet and tentative, cut through the stillness of the cockpit. "How long have you been flying?" John asked, his gaze fixed on the control panel in front of him, though Mark could hear the underlying curiosity in his voice. Mark turned his head slightly, eyeing the young pilot out of the corner of his eye. "A while," he answered simply. "Long enough to know that flying isn't about being flashy. It's about knowing what you're doing when things go wrong." John's brows furrowed, his grip tightening on the armrest. "Things do go wrong?" Mark smiled slightly. "They always do. But you learn how to handle it. You learn to stay calm, even when everything around you is spinning out of control. There was a brief silence as John absorbed the words. Mark could tell he was struggling with the idea. The young pilot had likely come into aviation with dreams of flying high above the clouds, living out the kind of glamorous life people saw in movies. But the reality of aviation was far from glamorous. It was about discipline, about control, and most importantly, about handling the unexpected. John nodded, though Mark could see the unease still lingering in his eyes. I'm still getting used to it, he confessed, a note of vulnerability in his voice that Mark hadn't expected. I thought I was ready, but I didn't know it would be this intense. Mark could feel the tension between them, the unspoken question hanging in the air, who was the real pilot here? John, with his youthful optimism and desire to prove himself, or Mark, with years of experience under his belt, carrying the weight of every decision on his shoulders? It's normal to feel that way, Mark replied, his voice steady but not unkind. The trick is not to let it overwhelm you. You'll get used to it. You just have to keep your head in the game. Flying isn't about feeling in control, it's about knowing how to act when things get uncertain. John glanced over at him then, his expression more open than before. I guess that's what I'm afraid of. I don't want to mess up. I don't want to let anyone down. Mark nodded, understanding all too well the fear that came with responsibility. You won't let anyone down. But it's not just about doing your job. It's about being able to trust yourself. And that only comes with time. Mark turned his attention back to the instruments, but there was a shift in the air. It wasn't just the conversation, it was something deeper. A recognition, maybe. John wasn't the only one on this flight with something to prove. Mark had his own demons, his own battles with doubt. It wasn't something he spoke about, but it was always there, lurking in the background. Every flight was a reminder of what he had sacrificed to get here. The late nights, the missed holidays, the strained relationships, the endless hours of travel, it had all come at a cost. And yet, in this moment, Mark realized something. He wasn't just flying the plane for himself. He was flying it for John too. For every young pilot who had come into the profession with dreams and ambitions, only to be met with the crushing weight of responsibility. He was here to teach, not just to fly. You'll get there, Mark said quietly, his voice a little softer than before. We all have our first flights. The trick is to not let it be your last. John looked at him, and for the first time since the flight began, there was a flicker of understanding in his eyes. A moment of clarity. Mark could see it in the way John's posture loosened just slightly, the tension easing from his shoulders. It was small, but it was enough. The young pilot wasn't quite there yet, but he was on his way. As the flight continued, Mark could feel the weight of their unspoken bond growing stronger. It wasn't about proving who was better, who was more experienced, or who could control the aircraft more effectively. It was about knowing when to step back and trust your co-pilot. It was about understanding that experience, while valuable, could be shared. Mark let the silence fall again, but this time, it wasn't uncomfortable. It wasn't the awkward quiet that had come from the young pilot's nervousness. No, this silence felt different. It was a quiet partnership, a shared understanding that they were in this together. The turbulence they both faced was different, but the challenge was the same. And as the plane sailed smoothly through the skies, Mark felt a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't just about flying anymore. It was about teaching, guiding, and showing the next generation of pilots that the skies belonged to everyone who had the courage to take control of their destiny. And John Rivers, whether he realized it yet or not, was learning that lesson, one flight at a time, the calm before the storm. The hours passed in a steady rhythm as the plane flew through the skies, its engines humming like a well-oiled machine. Mark remained at the helm, his focus unwavering. There was something oddly peaceful about the air now, almost as if the turbulence they had all felt earlier had been absorbed into the endless stretch of blue. Yet beneath the surface calm, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that today's flight was different. It wasn't just the usual long-haul journey or the typical duties of a seasoned pilot. Something about the young man sitting beside him, John Rivers, had unsettled him in a way he hadn't anticipated. As they cruised at 35,000 feet, the air felt oddly serene, and for a moment, Mark allowed himself to relax. The cockpit was silent again, save for the rhythmic beeping of the instruments, the soft hum of the engines, and the occasional crackling of the intercom. John, still adjusting to the long stretches of quiet, seemed lost in his thoughts, occasionally glancing at the monitors as if looking for signs of impending disaster. Mark could sense the young man's discomfort, but he knew better than to press him. John was still new to the game, just starting to find his feet. And for all the bravado and confidence he had shown earlier, there was an undercurrent of fear that Mark couldn't ignore. Fear that was natural for someone so young in this line of work. "How are you holding up?" Mark finally broke the silence, glancing sideways at his co-pilot. John blinked as if startled by the question. His eyes darted around the cockpit, clearly searching for something, anything, to confirm that he was indeed in control. "I'm good," he said, but the uncertainty in his voice betrayed his words. "Just trying to wrap my head around it all." Mark nodded, recognizing the struggle. "It takes time," he said, his voice low and steady. "You don't get it all in one go. Some days, you'll feel like a pro. Other days, you'll feel like you don't know anything at all." John's gaze flicked to him, a flicker of realization crossing his face. "You still feel that way sometimes?" Mark smiled, a genuine, rare smile that reflected the wisdom of someone who had been through the grind. "All the time. The difference is, now I know how to hide it." The young man laughed, though it was strained. Mark could see the tension still holding him captive, like an invisible weight around his shoulders. The flight was calm for now, but Mark knew it was only a matter of time before that calm would break. The real test, the one that separated the true pilots from the rest, always came in moments like these, when things seemed too perfect, when the autopilot kicked in, and you let your guard down. And that was when it happened. A sudden shift in the air, sharp, unexpected. The steady hum of the engines faltered for a brief second, and the entire aircraft jolted with a force that caught both pilots off guard. Mark's hand instinctively tightened around the controls, his eyes scanning the instruments, searching for any signs of malfunction. John's body stiffened beside him. Mark could hear him muttering under his breath, an instinctive reaction to the sudden turbulence. It wasn't much, just a minor shift in the atmosphere, a slight deviation from the smooth air they had been enjoying, but it was enough. Enough to throw any rookie off balance. Mark didn't flinch. He didn't need to. Instead, his voice was steady, his tone a practiced calm. "Stay with it. It's just turbulence." John glanced at him, his face pale. But it came out of nowhere. Mark's gaze never wavered from the controls. "That's how it always is. Just stay calm. Look at the indicators, trust the instruments. Keep your hands steady." For a brief moment, John hesitated, clearly wrestling with the instinct to panic. But Mark's confidence, his steady presence in the face of uncertainty, seemed to cut through the young pilot's panic. Slowly, John shifted in his seat and began to follow Mark's lead. He adjusted the throttle, his hands shaking slightly but determined. Mark could see the shift in his demeanor, the faintest trace of composure returning to his posture. It wasn't long before the turbulence passed, the plane settling back into its routine as if it had never been disturbed. The engine's hum resumed its regular pitch, and the air outside once again became calm. But in that brief moment, Mark saw something in John's eyes, something that hadn't been there before. The young pilot was learning. "You did well," Mark said, finally breaking the silence once again. His words were simple, but they carried the weight of something deeper. John had held it together, just as Mark had instructed, and it made all the difference. He wasn't just a rookie anymore. He was becoming a pilot in that very moment. John let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. He didn't respond at first, but Mark could see the wheels turning in his mind. The turbulence had been a small challenge, something that most seasoned pilots wouldn't think twice about. But for John, it was a test. One that he hadn't passed yet, but had come so much closer to. I guess I did, John admitted, his voice quieter now. He didn't seem as jittery as he had before, and there was a subtle shift in his posture. A new level of focus had replaced the previous apprehension. Mark nodded, his gaze returning to the flight path ahead. Just remember, turbulence is the easy part. It's what comes after that matters. John raised an eyebrow, intrigued. What do you mean? Mark's lips curved into a slight smile. Turbulence is temporary. It's unpredictable, sure, but it doesn't last long. What really matters is what you do when the sky's clear. When everything seems to go perfectly. That's when you have to stay sharp. That's when the real challenges come. John absorbed the words, a flicker of understanding crossing his features. Mark didn't need to explain further. John would come to realize it on his own. The true test of a pilot wasn't in how they handled the rough patches, but how they navigated the calm. The calm was where complacency could set in, where things could be taken for granted, and that was the most dangerous place for any pilot to be. The flight continued on, the rest of the journey smooth and uneventful. But the lessons of that brief moment of turbulence lingered in the air. Mark watched as John became more comfortable, his confidence growing slowly with each passing minute. It was subtle at first, just the slightest change in his movements. His posture was more relaxed, and his eyes were scanning the instruments with a steadier gaze. He was learning, step by step, to trust himself. And most importantly, to trust the process. By the time they neared their destination, Mark felt a sense of quiet pride. The young man beside him wasn't the same person who had sat down in that cockpit a few hours ago. He had made progress. The shift was small, but it was undeniable. The plane began its descent, and Mark's hands moved fluidly, guiding the aircraft down toward the runway with the practiced precision of someone who had done it 1,000 times before. John followed his lead, and together, they prepared for the final phase of the flight. There were no more nervous glances or uncertain questions. There was only focus, pure, unwavering focus. The landing was smooth, the wheels touching down with a soft hum. Mark could feel the shift in the aircraft as it slowed, the final descent into the safety of the runway. As they taxied toward the gate, Mark allowed himself a moment of reflection. John Rivers hadn't just made it through today's flight. He had grown. And that, more than anything else, was the mark of a true pilot. Mark smiled to himself, the quiet satisfaction of a job well done settling in his chest. He had taught John something today, something that couldn't be learned from textbooks or flight simulators. He had taught him how to handle the storm, how to stay grounded in the face of uncertainty, and how to keep flying even when the world around you was shifting. And in doing so, he had reminded himself of the very same lessons. The calm had broken. But the real work had only just begun, the weight of responsibility. The aircraft taxied toward the gate, the hum of the engines slowly dissipating as they came to a stop. The familiar routine of landing, taxiing, and preparing for disembarkation filled the cockpit. But Mark's mind was elsewhere, reflecting on the young pilot beside him. John Rivers had come a long way in a matter of hours. The young man who had once been filled with nervous energy and uncertainty had now found his footing, however tenuously. Mark knew that today's flight wasn't just another routine journey, it was the beginning of something important for John. Something that would shape his career and his understanding of what it meant to be a true pilot. It wasn't about just flying a plane, it was about being ready when things went wrong, staying composed when the world seemed to be crumbling around you, and being able to take charge in the most unexpected of moments. As the plane came to a complete stop at the gate, Mark quickly shifted into autopilot mode. He instructed John to begin the process of shutting down the engines and completing the post-flight checklist. The young pilot followed his orders without hesitation, his hands moving more confidently this time, less shaky than before. "You did well today," Mark said, his voice quieter now as the buzz of the cabin filled the background. John gave him a quick glance but didn't say anything right away. Instead, he focused on finishing his tasks, still processing everything that had just happened in the past few hours. Once the flight was officially over and the plane was parked, Mark unbuckled his seatbelt and stood up, stretching his arms. He felt the familiar ache in his muscles, proof of how long he'd been on his feet, how hard he'd worked to maintain his focus throughout the flight. But it wasn't the physical fatigue that weighed on him today. It was something else, the realization that what had started as just another flight was now a milestone in someone else's journey. As they exited the cockpit, Mark was surprised to find the young pilot looking at him with a renewed sense of respect. John had always been polite, but now there was a different energy in the air between them, an unspoken acknowledgement of what had transpired. And Mark could see it in John's eyes, there was a depth now, a maturity that hadn't been there before. "Thank you," John said, his voice quiet but sincere. "For everything. I didn't think I could handle it today. But I think I'm starting to get it." Mark nodded, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "You handled it better than I thought you would. Remember, you've got the basics down. Now it's about building on that, finding your rhythm. The real test doesn't happen when everything's smooth, it happens when the storm comes." John nodded, his face thoughtful as he processed the words. Mark could tell the weight of the lesson wasn't lost on him. This was the turning point for John Rivers, the moment he would look back on as the day he became more than just a trainee. This was the moment when he had begun to understand the true nature of the skies. "Thanks again," John said, offering a firm handshake. Mark accepted it with a steady grip, recognizing that there was a bond now between them. Not just as co-pilots, but as professionals who had shared something profound in that cockpit. As they left the aircraft and made their way through the terminal, the noise of the airport was deafening again. The usual chaos was back, the ebb and flow of passengers moving with little regard for the pilots who had just navigated them across the sky. It was a stark contrast to the peaceful silence of the cockpit where they had spent the last several hours. Mark found himself drifting into the familiar routine of preparing for the next leg of the journey. He still had a few hours before his next flight, and he knew the rhythm of the day would be just as demanding as the last. But despite the exhaustion gnawing at him, there was something that kept him from feeling entirely depleted. There was a quiet pride in knowing that he had played a part in John's growth today. He had shared with him a piece of wisdom that would carry the young man forward, one that couldn't be found in any manual or textbook. It was the kind of knowledge that only came with experience, the kind that could only be passed down. Mark headed toward the crew lounge, his thoughts still on the flight. He couldn't help but think back to the moment when he had realized what was at stake. That moment of turbulence had been the tipping point, not just for John, but for Mark too. It was a reminder that aviation was more than just a career. It was a calling. A responsibility. Every day, pilots carried the weight of others' lives on their shoulders. And that responsibility never stopped, never eased up. It was always there, quietly pressing down, a constant reminder of the stakes. But that wasn't what bothered Mark. What bothered him was the unrelenting pace of the job. The constant pressure to be perfect, to be ready for anything, to have an answer for every question before it was even asked. He had been in this world long enough to know that the challenges were never the same. Every flight brought with it a new set of obstacles, a new set of demands. But the one thing that remained constant was the weight of the job. The expectation that no matter how tired you were, no matter how long you had been awake, you had to be ready. Always. The lounge was quieter than usual, the sound of the television droning on in the background as Mark sank into one of the chairs. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the fatigue take over his body. It wasn't just his physical exhaustion that was weighing him down now. It was the mental toll of constantly being on, of always being the one others looked to for answers, for guidance. And yet, even in his weariness, Mark knew that he wouldn't trade this life for anything. Being a pilot wasn't just about the flights, the destinations, or the glamorous images people had of the profession. It was about the responsibility, the lives in your hands, the trust passengers placed in you every time they boarded a plane. It was about knowing that you were a small part of a much bigger world, but that you played a role in keeping it all moving, keeping it all together. A few hours passed, and Mark soon found himself standing at the gate once again, ready to board the next flight. He wasn't sure what the day would bring, or how many more challenges he would face, but he knew one thing for sure: he was ready. He was always ready. Because that's what it meant to be a pilot. As the plane prepared for takeoff once again, Mark sat back in his seat, his thoughts momentarily drifting back to John. He hoped the young man had learned something valuable today, that the sky was a place where uncertainty was a constant companion, but so was the ability to navigate it. John was no longer just another rookie on his first flight. He was a part of the brotherhood that spanned generations of pilots, a legacy of responsibility, of trust, and of unwavering dedication. And as Mark's eyes scanned the horizon, watching the runway stretch before them, he knew that the skies would always be home. But it was the people you flew with, whether as a co-pilot, a mentor, or a stranger, that made the journey worthwhile.